for me and Suzanne, of course, for organizing. The first slide has a quote that I want to thank Devin for. He gave a great talk. I hope many of you were able to see it about oral history projects. And I really found it quite useful in thinking about my remarks today. I also just want to say as a preface that I'm not sure if what I'm presenting you today is going to, arrive in the final product of my work. It may be more of a process that I kind of need to go through as a scholar confronting this material. So your feedback is appreciated, and I appreciate your being here today. So we could go to the next slide if you would, please. This slide is a poem that I encountered for the first time at the monument to the victims of lynching in Montgomery, Alabama, that was founded by the Equal Justice Initiative. And this is where I got my title. It's slightly different from the poem here, You Are Luminous. So I'll just give you a moment to read about the poem and then to read the poem. So part one, I've entitled Locating Myself, something that one does in feminist theory circles, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this term. Basically, I tell my students to say, who the hell is this that's talking? What do they know? Who are they? It's important to find out who it is that's saying this stuff. So locating myself. As a 22-year-old new college graduate, I was a Fulbright scholar to Germany. I felt a resonance with German culture in part because I wanted to understand how to negotiate my identity as someone who comes from a culture with blood on its hands. A German university student said to me, I've gone to international events and other students are saying, yay, I'm from Ireland, yay, I'm from France. But I never want to wave the flag and say, yay, I'm from Germany. I knew what she meant. Even though there are plenty of accomplishments to be proud of in German culture, the Holocaust looms. I come from the South, specifically from Little Rock, Arkansas, and I don't often say, yay, I'm from the South, even though there are aspects of my background I'm grateful for. For example, I was very privileged to have been educated often by Black teachers about the richness of African-American history and literature. I attended Little Rock Central High School at a time when the student body was almost 70% Black, and we were called a model for race relations in the country. Growing up, I thought a lot about the Little Rock Nine, was inspired by their courage and their fortitude. Also, Senator Fulbright came from Arkansas. The time I spent in Germany was formative for me. I returned to the US for graduate school where I studied literature about the Holocaust and different ways people convey stories of trauma. I read about how the German public has dealt with the history of the Holocaust in their museums and memorials, etc. Side note, some civil rights museums in the US have looked to Germany's Holocaust memorials as examples of how to approach this type of memory work. I also read about how Israeli museums confront this painful history and tie it into the establishment of the State of Israel. In the past 25 years since I was in graduate school, there's been an explosion in areas like memory studies, museum studies, public history, and scholars from many backgrounds have investigated such issues. People from performance studies, history, sociology, museum studies, political science, and others. Sometimes I just wish I could go back to school and get another degree at museum studies. Side note, I was able to audit the very first museum studies course here at Gettysburg College last fall. And Sarah Kate Gillespie is teaching a first-year seminar this fall in museum studies. I've also researched South African drama and how that society has dealt with museums and memorials post-apartheid. One other quick autobiographical note, I had the honor of leading the immersion trip for the study of civil rights through the Center for Public Service in 2003 and 2004. That was my first trip as an adult to the Deep South. That trip takes students to Atlanta, where the King Center is located, to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which sits across from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the 4 little girls were bombed by white supremacists in 1963, and sits in front of the Kelly Ingram Park, where police armed with dogs and fire hoses injured young protesters. Students also go to the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and since its opening in 2018, to the new Equal Justice Initiative Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which includes the memorial to the victims of lynching, where I saw the poem that I shared with you before. We also went to Tuskegee University, founded by Booker T. Washington, where there's a museum dedicated to the work of George Washington Carver, who was a faculty member there. And to Selma and the National Voting Rights Museum. I was so inspired by the people we met there that I knew I had to go back. Fast forward, and my son, who is 13, was now old enough to go with me. I spent 6 months in Selma, Alabama from January to June 2020. And by the way, CPS has conducted this trip for many years through friendships established by Carl Mattson. And through the efforts of Michael Bertner, students have been instrumental in collecting oral histories. I'm very grateful to Gretchen Natter, Linda Miller, and all those who have served as leaders and organizers to keep this trip alive. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the first one is museums that I have visited just in my life, civil rights museums. And then the next slide, if you could please, Jen, would be the museums that I had initially decided to focus on. And then I took a short site visit in August and made some changes to my study. And then the last slide, if you would bring that one up, the next one, I mean, those changes that I had done as of August 2019, and then COVID changes. I volunteered with particular organizations, and I listed those because I was adamant from the get-go. I didn't want to be some white lady from outside busting in just to take. I wanted to heed the strategy quoted at the beginning of building trust in order to practice allyship. Once I was in Selma, locals told me plenty of stories of outsiders of all types who would come to Selma, pledge help, go away again with their book or their movie or their other project in hand, never to be heard from again. And I definitely don't want to be someone like that. But not only did I relish the relationships fostered during the volunteer work, it also made it easier for me to be able to call on people for interviews once everything shut down, because we'd had a chance to get to know one another in person from January through mid-March. I was also a deputy senator, which was really fun, helping out the local senator with her census information distribution. And I was a lunch lady, also fun and hard work once the schools closed down and we were feeding children in the community. Most of all, of course, I truly enjoyed getting to know other workers and volunteers doing what people in Selma routinely refer to as teamwork for the dream work. Because my research is in its early stages, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a generalized overview, but I hope it'll whet your appetite to visit these places and experience them for yourselves. That's really my main goal in presenting today, not for the sake of my friends in Alabama, but for all of you. When I first told friends and colleagues at the college that I was going to Alabama, the reaction across the board, no matter what one's ethnic background was mostly the same. Who on earth would want to go there? Why on earth would anyone want to go there? One person told me, when I hear the word Alabama, I think of bodies hanging from trees. People think backward, ignorant, bigoted, redneck, scary. And indeed, these terms are not inaccurate. But there were also brave, inspiring, and credible African Americans there, many of whom were active during the 60s and are still advocating for change today, like Joanne Bland, who was 11 years old when she marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. On the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama on March 7th, 1965, the forces of good and evil clashed. It is sacred ground to cross that bridge and to think of the blood shed there. The bridge where John Lewis was clubbed, the bridge where so many were injured, protesting peacefully for the right to vote and against police brutality. In 2021, the bridge crossing Jubilee in March, this coming March, which is the commemoration of the events of Bloody Sunday, it's going to be all virtual. So you'll all be able to participate in the many activities, speakers, and artistic events. I'm going to show you actually a brief 3-minute long promotional video for the upcoming Jubilee. Right now, actually, I'm not going to show you. Jan is going to show you. Is it working? Oh, there's not sound though. Can you hear it?
No, is no sound.
Okay, thank you.
I think the sound may be in the computer itself. So you have to click on that. That might be one possible reason why we are not hearing it.
You also need to share the screen. When you click share screen, then you can enable, share computer screen as well. So you might have to unshare and then reshare again and then enable that option.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Let's
That's
try
okay.
it again.
Let's try it again. It's all good.
Can you hear me?
No.
Nope. At the top of the screen where you're sharing, there's a little mute or unmute.
Mm-mm.
No? Okay.
When you go to share your screen,
Yeah.
when you get to choose what application you're going to share, in the bottom lower left-hand corner, there's a little box that you need to check that says share computer sound.
Yeah.
So I think you need to go back, reshare your screen, and when you select your, check that little box. It's in the share screen box.
Okay.
As we commemorate
There
their achievement, we
Yay.
also
Okay. Stop talking.
serve to remember that at the time of the marches, many in power condemned rather than praised them. They were called communists, or half-breeds, or outside agitators, sexual and moral degenerates, and worse. They were called everything but the name their parents gave them. Their faith was questioned. Their lives were threatened. Their patriotism challenged. And yet, what could be more American than what happened in this place? What could more profoundly
Sorry.
vindicate the idea of America than plain and humble people. Unsung, the downtrodden, the dreamers not of high state.
Sorry, y'all. The digital divide is a thing.
Okay, what?
Not born to wealth or privilege.
I think that my internet is just too slow and is not going to
That's
be able
okay.
to support the whole video. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay. You got the website, folks. You know, it may be just as well because usually I'm just in tears after this. So. Okay. Thank you.
Do you want?
All right.
Do you want the next
next
slide?
Is the initial project in question. I'm going to try to talk a little faster. Honoring the founders and chronicling the histories of museums founded by African Americans in 3 key historical cities: Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, Alabama. And then the questions are basic. Who created the museums and their content? Who maintains them? What are the main triumphs and challenges? COVID-19 forced me to focus on Selma, but I discovered there was more than enough in Selma to focus on. And in fact, the most compelling aspects of this research were revealed in the course of the interviews and encompassed issues that I hadn't foreseen. I suspect this is not unusual in this type of research. As James Baldwin wrote, quote, "American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything that anyone has ever said about it," unquote. Today, I want to focus mostly on the National Voting Rights Museum because that's where I had the chance to volunteer and to observe firsthand, conduct the most interviews, and this museum was the main one that I'd wanted to research from the beginning. The initial idea for the museum was conceived in 1991, and the notion was to honor those who were called the foot soldiers of the movement, the regular people, the lay people. African-American citizens had been working for voting rights since the 1920s in Selma, but the town is small and economic conditions very difficult, and those in power were loath to give it up. Even as other campaigns were undertaken around the country, sorry, got a cat on the table, get down, get down. Even as, oh boy, other campaigns were undertaken around the country, Selma was not initially targeted in the 1960s. The word on the ground from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was, quote, "the white people were too mean and the Black people were too scared." Nonetheless, a 22-year-old theology student named Bernard Lafayette pleaded for the opportunity to lead a campaign in Selma. So he did in 1963. By the way, Dr. Lafayette is still alive and well and leading training on nonviolent protest, which I was privileged to attend thanks to a grant from our Office of Diversity and Inclusion. A group of voting rights activists in Selma, now known as the Courageous Eight, had invited Dr. King to speak against the will of a number of other Black leaders who felt he was too controversial. They knew that when Dr. King came to a town, he would bring with him the spotlights and the journalists, but after he left, the people were left in dangerous situations with angry white citizens to contend with. When a young Black man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by a state trooper while attempting to protect his grandfather from police brutality in a small town near Selma, Black community members decided to march the 54 miles from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery as a protest. Dr. King was not involved in the first march that happened on Sunday, March 7th, 1965. On that day, when the peaceful protesters crossed the bridge, they were met with a blue wall of police. After giving them a 3-minute warning, 1 minute later, police surged forward, attacking the peaceful protesters with tear gas, billy clubs, and the hooves of their horses. The bridge is very steep and there's nowhere to flee. Around 70 people were injured that day, some seriously, including John Lewis. And the television footage, as you know, was broadcast around the world. King subsequently led another march 2 days later that ended up with his somewhat unpopular decision to turn around. But a couple of weeks later, the same police officers who had attacked the protesters were now officially tasked with protecting them. for the historic march to the state capitol in Montgomery. It was exactly these foot soldiers from Bloody Sunday and the ones who participated in the march to Montgomery a short while later that the National Voting Rights Museum wanted to honor. Before they had a building, it was a museum on paper, according to its founder, Faya Rose Touré. The museum opened its doors in 1993 after Miss Touré, a local lawyer, and her husband, Senator Hank Sanders, spent a few years trying to find white people willing to sell property on the main street, Water Street, which runs parallel to the bridge. Mr. Sanders, by the way, was the first African-American state senator from the Alabama Black Belt. Different members on the board of directors for the museum sponsored different rooms in the museum, including the Children's Room, chronicling youngsters' involvement in activism, sponsored by a progressive Black school in town. The Reconstruction Room, chronicling the history of Reconstruction in Selma, including the story of Jeremiah Harrelson, who was born enslaved, sold to a man in Selma, where he educated himself, and served as a senator under Reconstruction. This room was sponsored by the Sanders Law Firm. Other groups sponsored other rooms, and Marie Foster, a leader for voter registration prior to King's visit, donated her personal artifacts for a room dedicated to the Courageous Eight. One of the women's groups in town created a room dedicated to the women in the local civil rights struggle. In her book, Desegregating the Past, the Public Memory, the Public Life of Memory in the United States and South Africa, sociologist Robin Autry notes that, quote, the first 4 Black history museums in the United States, founded independently of any college or university, in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., were all founded by local Black civic leaders of various stripes, unquote, by activists, that is, not professional historians or museum curators. This is certainly also the case of the National Voting Rights Museum. Autry also notes that most museums of African-American history were founded by men, and most lack the inclusion of many women or stories about Reconstruction. In fact, some of the bigger and more financially stable museums are only just now beginning to chronicle histories that include Reconstruction and women's stories. So the National Voting Rights Museum is ahead of the curve in that sense. Shortly after it was established, Miss Touré acquired another property downtown and opened the Slavery and Civil War Museum, later renamed the Ancient Africa, Enslavement, and Civil War Museum, further down Water Street from the bridge. Again, Autry notes that more recent museums have begun to include the history of African Americans in Africa. So again, the National Voting Rights Museum and Institute is ahead of the curve. Additional rooms have been added over time to incorporate other events, such as the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and an oral history project interviewing contemporary Selmians. According to the museum's historian, Sam Walker, when the notice of the opening of the museum appeared in the local newspaper, an officer from the Department of Public Safety contacted them to offer a donation of police photographs from Bloody Sunday and other events, a donation they willingly accepted. Side note, because of the large number of foot soldiers and their significant efforts, many in Selma do not support changing the name of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to honor John Lewis, because he was only one of so many who marched and were brutalized. Edmund Pettus, whom the bridge is named after, was a Confederate officer during the Civil War and a leader in the KKK. So some people believe it should be renamed the Freedom Bridge. Others want to keep it as it is, perhaps appreciating the irony of the name or believing that it gives contemporary citizens a better overall picture of the foot soldiers' struggle in Selma. Next slide, please. So here are these unexpected issues that popped up. First unexpected issue, heritage site development and competition. When I first drove to Selma from Montgomery in August 2019 on my short site visit, I was delighted to see that the National Park Service had opened up a museum on the highway between Selma and Montgomery in order to commemorate the route of the historic march, which took place March 21st through 25th, 1965. Tens of thousands of people joined the marchers along the way and as they converged at the state capitol in Montgomery. By the way, if you go to Montgomery, on one corner in front of the state capitol in Montgomery is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, now called Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, because King preached there. Almost exactly on the other side of the state capitol, equidistant, is the first White House of the Confederacy. I was thrilled to see the Selma to Montgomery Trail Interpretive Center established by the National Park Service, because when I first came to Selma back in 2003, I met Bob Mance, a freedom fighter who can be seen in the second row of marchers in the iconic photos on the bridge, behind John Lewis with a cap and flood pants. Bob Mance spoke to Gettysburg students for years, and I was privileged to get to meet him. He advocated for such recognition of the march, which went right through Lowndes County where he lived. He also amassed an amazing collection of artifacts from the period. Later, as I drove into Selma, again, I was delighted to see a big, beautiful National Park Service Interpretive Center right downtown Selma. The downtown looked less shabby than it had in 2003, so it seemed that maybe things were looking up economically. The National Voting Rights Museum had to move to the other side of the bridge from town, where the police met the protesters, closer to the site of the violence in the historical moment, but further from town and the potential benefits of tourist traffic. Tourists do generally cross over the bridge though, so the museum is right at the foot of the bridge on the other side from town. What I hadn't suspected, however, was the impact of the Interpretive Center on the smaller community museum, and also the ways that the Park Service worked with local community members on the Lowndes County facility. My white privilege blinded me to the potential of negative effects of outsiders telling local stories. I wasn't able to connect with National Park Service officials, so the story of what happened I gained from interviews from local Selma residents involved in the discussions and from newspaper accounts. I will conduct interviews with the National Park Service as soon as I can. And I don't necessarily mean to accuse the Park Service of intentional discrimination against any given individuals or groups. But it is true now that some in the African-American community in Selma, including some foot soldiers and their allies, see these interpretive centers as positive additions to town, and some do not. How this rupture came to be is what comes next. Of course, one of the biggest challenges in maintaining museums is always finances. The National Voting Rights Museum was put in the state's general budget from 1994 to 2003. Its sister museum, called at that time the Slavery Museum, opened in 2002 and also received state funding. But with a new governor in 2003, all museums in Alabama were taken out of the state budget. In 1996, Congress had designated monies for the Selma to Montgomery Historical Trail, some $13 million. There were to be 3 National Park Service interpretive centers in all, one in Lowndes County, which is right next door to Selma and through which the marchers traveled on the way to Montgomery, one in Selma, and one in Montgomery. The NPS and local community leaders all agreed that the first one to be built should be in Lowndes County. Since Selma already had the Voting Rights Museum, Montgomery already had other museums as well. As I mentioned before, this was also a dream of Bob Mance, who was one of the leaders on Bloody Sunday and a resident of Lowndes County. When the National Park Service superintendent received the $13 million, the idea that came up with was to build a replica of the historic Brown Chapel, where King preached when he was in Selma and also the site of many local meetings, and of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on site. This did not make sense to people in Selma because the real things, the church and the bridge, were right up the road. Eventually, the building that you see now has incorporated elements of the church and the bridge and the state capitol and its architecture in a really beautiful and inventive way. But that project ended up costing $10 million of the $13 million designated for the 3 different sites. The Lowndes County Interpretive Center opened in 2006. Selma got $1 million for its interpretive center, which opened in 2011 and is set to undergo a $2.1 million expansion, which was supposed to be completed before the end of this year, but is now presumably on hold. The third site in Montgomery is located on the campus of Alabama State University and opened March 25th, 2020 to a limited audience, and I was unable to visit this site because of COVID-19. Controversy surrounded these efforts as park officials seemed to have courted one set of locals over another. Eventually, Bob Mance, who had the dream of the museum for so long, boycotted the Lowndes County Museum before his death, and his treasure of artifacts remains in the position of his widow. I hope to be able to interview her. The National Voting Rights Museum has suffered in its number of visitors due to the National Park Service interpretive site. Of course, I was dismayed to discover that what I initially perceived as great additions to the community had caused ruptures instead. When I revealed to the white park ranger at Lowndes County site that I came from Gettysburg and was familiar with the terrific programs one experiences at so many national parks, he confided in me that sometimes Black visitors are dismayed that there are not any Black rangers at this site. Also, a lot of the interpretation there focuses on Selma, even using the same introductory film as the one at the Selma site, though people in Lowndes County wanted this museum to specifically focus on their history. There is now a different head of the Lowndes County Museum who is from the area and may be able to make some changes once the pandemic allows them to reopen. There's also been some friction between locals who have chosen to work with the Park Service and those who have not. The founders of the National Voting Rights Museum and Institute want to control the content of their museum, which would probably not be possible if they were to merge their collection with the Interpretive Center. On the other hand, the National Voting Rights Museum was suffering from financial losses even before the pandemic. Their archives are stored in an area that's not properly protective. Excuse me. As a matter of fact, some of the archive was destroyed in a hurricane a few years ago, and thank goodness Gettysburg College had digitized some of the oral histories. And right now, CPS, the library, and IT are in the process of trying to copy those resources for the museum. If Gettysburg College hadn't done that, those oral histories would have been lost forever, as some of those interviews have since passed away. Unexpected issue number 2, target audience, audience reception, and disparate impact. I'm purposely using the term disparate impact here incorrectly or at best imprecisely in order to broaden its meaning to a more symbolic realm. In labor law, disparate impact is a term used to prove employment discrimination based on the effects of a policy or practice rather than the intent behind it. This idea foregrounds that sometimes apparently neutral policies with no intention to discriminate also result in discriminatory labor practices nonetheless. Perhaps that term could be utilized to describe the financial loss experienced by the National Voting Rights Museum when the National Park Service came to town. Here, however, I want to use this term to talk about emotional and psychic labor in terms of museum visitors' response to museum content. By using the term disparate impact to refer to audience reception, I want to convey the idea that presenting stories of trauma against Black minds and bodies has differing impacts on Black audiences than on white audiences, on Black museum visitors versus white museum visitors. Of course, every individual is unique, and thus the way each person reacts to a particular exhibit varies. But in the case of the National Voting Rights Museum, which has been open for 27 years now, museum officials have some noteworthy insights on this topic. My purpose in bringing up the idea of disparate impact is not as a litmus test for a museum's discrimination against a particular group, as is the case of its usage in labor law, but rather to underscore the need for sensitivity and maybe even differing resources to be made available to different constituencies, as you will see became the strategy of one organization in Selma. Once again, my white privilege blinded me and caused me to feel surprised when I spoke with a young Black woman who worked at the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery. When I asked her quite broadly about what her experiences were working at the museum, which is located at the site where Parks was arrested and is sponsored by Troy University, she mentioned that very few people from, quote, the older generation, unquote, came to the museum. When I asked her why she thought that was, not knowing whether she meant white people or Black people or both, she said she suspected was because it was too painful for them, too traumatic, because it was something they themselves had lived through and they didn't want to revisit the racism they'd suffered in real life through the exhibits. Sociologist Robin Autry points out that, quote, in the case of Black museums, the selective use of language to de-emphasize victimhood in favor of a more empowering image of group identity is evident in the amplification of instances of slave resistance, rebellion, and escape, unquote. In an interview Autry conducted with the head curator at the African American Museum and Cultural Center of Iowa in Cedar Rapids in 2006, Autry relates that the curator acknowledged she had added an informational panel about slave rebellions, quote, when she learned from local school teachers that many Black children, especially boys, expressed embarrassment when learning about Black subjugation in front of their peers during field trips, unquote. She chose this route in direct response to the student reactions, despite the fact that rebellions of enslaved Americans were, according to Autry, relatively infrequent. At the sister museum of the National Voting Rights Museum, initially named the Slavery Museum, current director R. Abayomi Goodall, or Sister Yomi, noted a similar dynamic upon observing school groups. She said she was glad when the focus expanded to include the current focus of the museum, now renamed Ancient Africa, Enslavement, and Civil War Museum. She said, quote, we get visitors from all over the world, Europe, Africa, and I didn't want my own people to just be embarrassed, angry, or depressed, dehumanized, particularly in a mixed group. I wanted to empower and uplift them, unquote. She also mentioned that getting locals to visit the museum was like pulling teeth. Another museum official, Afriye We Can Do This, told me about some experiences she had with white visitors. One of the great parts about working at the National Voting Rights Museum was that people come from all over the country and all over the world to visit. For example, quote, a young lady came from Japan by herself just to come to Selma. When she came in, she took her shoes off because this was sacred ground, she said, unquote. One white visitor was looking at information about Jim Clark, the notoriously brutal sheriff in Selma, and revealed that Jim Clark was her grandfather. But she insisted, I am not like him, unquote. Miss We Can Do This, also known as Sister Afriye, also discussed a young white man whom she noticed didn't really seem to want to engage, even though she talked about history in a way that is, quote, not shaming or blaming. One of the young Black women in the group, there were only 4 in a large group of otherwise white people, began to cry. The other Black women joined her and they were all crying. Quote, you could see that it began to affect the white student. You could see him begin to change, unquote. The Black students told her they had been to a nearby plantation museum and to the Memorial for Victims of Lynching in Montgomery. Sister Afriye calls them trauma spaces. And she told the group leader that the students hadn't been given time to reflect, to process their experiences. The leader, who was white, said he noticed that something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what, and he didn't know how to respond to the young women's reaction. After they went back home, the young man's mother called Sister Afriye at the museum and said, what did you do to my son? He's even changed his attitude towards me, unquote. As part of her work at the National Voting Rights Museum, it became clear to Sister Afriye that there was a need to care for certain types of responses. Quote, at a museum, you can't have people lying down on the floor. It's hard to have a place where people can cry or lie down to compose themselves, though it did sometimes happen at the museum, unquote. She wanted to create a space where such reactions were possible and safe. Also in 2005, she says, God gave her the idea of recreating a reenactment experience. In this piece, visitors experience a taste of the brutality of the dehumanized treatment of enslaved people, but she also creates within the piece room for conversation, reflection, and healing. And I should say both of these heads of Africa enslavement, ancient Africa enslavement and Civil War museums are performing artists. In 2010, Afriye was able to open her own space near the Ancient Africa Enslavement and Civil War Museum, where she's able to present the piece, where people have space to process, and where she also feeds people. It's a cozy, beautiful space filled with art, where workshops, poetry readings, and other events are organized for the local community. It's called By the River Center for Humanity. In this sense, this center takes on more of the character of earliest civil rights museum spaces, which operated more as community centers and resources for locals. In theological circles I sometimes frequent, there is a saying that the purpose of a liberatory religion is to, quote, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. In this sense, it could certainly be argued that because of the culture of silence surrounding slavery and its aftermath and the continued white privilege in the systemic and personal relationships in the United States, that white people are the comfortable who need some afflicting. In the fall of 2019, as I was planning my sabbatical, I happened to have had dinner with some members of the Board of Trustees of Gettysburg College. All the people at the table were white. Most of the people were men. I don't remember any of their names, by the way, so I couldn't tell you who they were even if I wanted to. I was explaining my proposed project, and one gentleman told me about how a theater he was involved with in his community was working on social justice issues. Another gentleman told me that he and his wife had visited the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum. But it was really awful, he said, what happened to us there. I truly couldn't imagine what he might say next, so I just listened. We were in the room, you know, the one with the big windows, the one that looks out at the church that was bombed. I nodded, the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the 4 little girls had been murdered by members of the KKK, inspired by hatred they had for the many children who were active in the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. Children's Crusade had happened in spring 1963, the bombing in September 1963. Yeah. He continued, there was a woman in there, an African-American woman with a young boy, and she pointed out the window and said to him, there is the place where that evil white man bombed the little girls who died. There's a sort of a memorial to the 4 little girls in that room with their pictures and their biographies. By the way, initially no one was prosecuted for the crimes, though the police charged the perpetrators. Eventually, one man was tried and convicted of 1 count of murder for 1 victim, 11-year-old Denise McNair. 2 others were finally tried and convicted to life imprisonment in 2001 and 2002. And the 4th perpetrator died in 1994, never having been convicted of any crime. The trustee turned and looked at me with a wounded look. Can you believe that, he said? She said, the evil white men. Now, why would she plant such seeds of hatred in that child's heart, he said. My wife and I had to leave the room. I was stunned by his story. I knew I needed to respond, but I was stunned and shaken. And again, it was probably my white privilege that caused my shock. I told him carefully that in the South, we often refer to white people as white people and black people as black people, a lot more than in the North. So maybe he wasn't used to hearing that. And I also tried to diplomatically explain, I probably would have said the same thing or something quite similar to my own son, but I really just wanted to scream at him. It seemed like he cared more about the reputation of white men in the eyes of the world than the reality of their brutality. Unexpected issue 3, inclusion of other organizations. Thinking about conversations like that one and others made me realize that alongside the museums, I needed to consider other organizations in order to get a fuller picture of how these stories are told. In Selma, there's a Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, which sponsors workshops and training. It's a community center I described above. There's Joanne Bland's tours called Journeys for the Soul. Miss Bland was a person I mentioned before who was 11 years old on the bridge on Bloody Sunday. Her tours are life-changing as she drives individuals around Selma and tells them the story up close and personal. I've also come to realize I need to perhaps chronicle other realities in town. There are some spaces that also tell the history of Selma, but the history is whitewashed. In the Live Oak Cemetery, for example, is a place called the Confederate Circle Monument. In this cemetery rests Benjamin Sterling Turner, who was enslaved and later became the first Black congressman from Alabama. Also buried there is Confederate General Edmund Pettus, mentioned above. In 2013, part of this land was sold to a group who raised a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, and other monuments to the Confederacy. And up until not that long ago, there were 2 streets that converged, Martin Luther King Boulevard and Jeff Davis Boulevard. You could see the crossed street signs sharing the same pole. Jeff Davis Boulevard has since been renamed after J.L. Chestnut, a prominent civil rights attorney, but my GPS didn't know that. As we consider our future as a nation, we really need to ask ourselves, as the civil rights song did, which side are you on? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. In conclusion, museums like the National Voting Rights Museum make explicit reference not only to the continuing struggle, but also to the ways that the movement of the 50s and 60s was always already about police brutality, economic injustice, and poverty, as well as desegregation and the right to vote, since all of these factors and more contributed to the inability to participate as full citizens in this society. A freedom fighter who spoke to the Gettysburg students, Wendell Paris, after detailing his experiences as an activist, left the students with this thought. He said, "Don't forget about us in Selma. We're still considered 3/5 of a person here," referring to the fact that the census count in the 19th century only counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. This mentality is not peculiar to the South. Thank you. Oh, and there's two other slides right quick. I know a lot of you know this stuff about how to be allies, but there's the website is www.selma50.com. Recognize the links. This is what President Obama was saying, the links between the current movement and all these struggles that have been going on since 1619. Scott Hancock's clarion call for more history. A group in town working for integration of the curriculum, and take the IDI. And if you've already taken it, consider training to be a qualified administrator to help become better at intercultural communication, respect, and humility. And then the very last slide is just my thank yous. Not just these. This is why these are great people. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thanks for a great presentation. We have about, 7-8 minutes left for questions. So if you have a question, I'm going to stop sharing here. If you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
I know Abu is there. I was wondering if anyone who had led the trip, if anybody who is, and Gretchen, if anybody who was participating in the trip before might have anything that they would want to add. And Brenda.
I'll just say really quickly, it continues to be a powerful experience. In the last couple of years, we actually have had trouble getting members of the Gettysburg College student body at large to be interested to actually run the project. So in more recent years, we've been taking our new student program coordinators from the Center for Public Service to Alabama as part of their ongoing training to look at civil rights movements, community organizing, and those kinds of things. But if there is interest in revitalizing this for students at large, we could certainly talk about that. But just to give a little update about how the trip is structured now. But Susan, I'm excited to keep talking more about your work. So thank you for sharing this today.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I was lucky that I got to hook up with the students who came down in January and kind of tag along. So that was really fun. And a couple of students that I'd actually had in class, I didn't realize were on the program. And also we've sponsored some within the theater arts department. And I personally, if there's any student that wants to go on this trip, we'll make it happen monetarily. And I'm sure there's others in the community that feel the same way. Carolyn Sauter, I noticed, asked about volunteering, if I was a docent. It's actually kind of funny, Carolyn, because I kind of wanted to work in the archives.
Yes, right. Okay, I was curious.
The archives, and they really needed, because of some illness and because the director, a lot of the people that are doing this community work in Selma are women, Black women in their 70s,
Right.
60s and 70s, not everyone, but a lot. And there had been some illness and et cetera. So the staffing was extremely skeletal at the National Voting Rights Museum. So for example, with a huge commemoration, the Jubilee, where thousands of people come, if you see that video, you'll see thousands of people crossing the bridge. My job on that Saturday at the National Voting Rights Museum was to man the cash register at the gift shop. And I'm horrible at that. And so I was telling everyone who came in, you need to donate please to this museum because the only person they have to do this job is me. And I'm so bad at it. And so, yeah, I ended up, but I did get to speak with visitors. There were people from all over the world that came, college students. This one young man, they had been to the Equal Justice Initiative, which these museums are fantastic. You can read about them. The Bryan Stevenson project. They had been there and then they had come to this museum and he asked me a question. It was a young African-American student from Chicago, I think. He asked me a question about these jar of jelly beans. And he said, oh, is that, you know, the prize you get if you register to vote or something like that? I said, no, that you had to guess how many jelly beans were in that jar to be able to vote. And he kind of got tears in his eyes and he said, can I give you a hug? I was like, oh, you know, so it was really, really phenomenal. I met people from Germany, just from all over. So I was able to at least do that some before the museum had to close its doors.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. I was curious what other roles you'd had.
Thank you. The staff at the museums, what do they say are their most pressing needs? You know, it's financial. It's financial. And we're trying to, I'm working together with, there's a new organizer of the Jubilee commemoration named Drew Glover. He's an activist from Oakland, California. He just came to town in June. He had been working with Selmians for a long time. And he's the one that is putting together the website. He's young, he's full of energy, he's just a magnificent person. He has asked me to help in terms of grant applications, writing letters of recommendation, and other scholars who have you know, been to Selma. And so they're on it. They're on it in terms of getting monies, but it's always about the money.
Before everybody goes, I just want to let you guys know that Susan's research was sponsored in part by a new grant that we have that is named after Laurel Cohen, who was a member of our faculty. And it was a grant that was established in her name, and it supports projects that are invested in peace and justice initiatives. And so, so part of Susan's was a RPD, but part of her sabbatical also was supported by this Laurel Cohen grant that we have now. And so if you have a project that's along these same kind of lines, I encourage you to reach out to me or to Jing, who's the chair of faculty development right now, to ask about those specifics.
Great. And also, speaking of chair of faculty development, I wanted to shout out to McKinley Melton too, because as I was applying for the grant, you know, he was helping me to make my requests a little bit more precise. And so I really appreciate that. It was, as you can tell, it was extremely life-changing for me and for my son. And I'm very grateful for all the assistance that I received from the college in so many ways, including Center for Public Service, of course.
Absolutely. So we're right at 1 o'clock now. I know some people still have questions. I encourage you to reach out to Susan. This is an ongoing project and she has lots of stuff to talk about. So thank you very much, Susan, for presenting today, and hope to see you guys back here next week. So thanks.
Thank you.